Hi, welcome to today's session. We're going to talk about migrating to SAP S4HANA and why, we're going to cover the top 10 reasons why it's the perfect time to implement Vertex. I'm Susie Sue, Senior Director of SAP Enablement here at Vertex, joined by Debbie Boone. But before we get started, wanted to run through a couple of housekeeping items with you just to orient you to the screen and the toolbar at the bottom of your console from left to right. First, you're going to see the media player where you can view Deborah and I and control your volume. Next is the slide widget where the presentation deck is viewed. To the right of that, you'll see some more information on how to connect with Deborah and I. And then also, you'll also see a Q&A tool where you're free to submit questions during our session. If we can, we'll answer them during the session. Otherwise, we'll follow up with you afterward. Feel free to submit those questions in at any point during the session. Also, you'll find a list of resources that you can download from today's session. And then finally, on the far right, you'll see some social emojis where you can share your live reactions with us. And we have a quick survey that you can take at any time. We've got a couple of questions just to help us understand where you are in your S4 journey and how you're handling your taxes. So with those housekeeping items, why don't we go ahead and get started with today's topic. Now, before we do jump in, though, quick introductions. Debbie, maybe you can tell the audience here a little bit about yourself and your background.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. Debbie Boone. I'm a sales engineer. My background is 33 years in tax technology, and the vast majority working in the SAP space. Many years consulting, so very familiar with the entire SAP landscape.
Fantastic. Yep, and I've been in the space for about 30 years myself as well, mainly working with SAP customers, implementing tax engines. My team has designed a lot of different tools that we install in SAP to help optimize the tax integration. But over the years, I've worked with a lot of companies that have implemented different versions of SAP going back to 3.1H. We're talking about the 90s here. Now everyone's doing the migration to S4HANA. So this is a very timely topic that we're going to talk about because we get asked a lot about, we're doing this big migration and, we've been looking at Vertex for many years, is now the right time? And the answer is yes. And so we're going to go through the 10 reasons why. But before we do, for those of you who don't know who Vertex is and what it is that we do, let's give you a quick overview. And we're just going to right up front, put everything out there. There's a lot here. We're not going to go through all this today. I think what we wanted to help you understand is that Vertex, we've been in this space for a long time. I think going back well over 40 years, Vertex was one of the pioneers in terms of tax content, turning that into tax software. And now we've grown the whole portfolio of the different products and services that we offer to cover global scope, many different types of taxes, many different steps within the function. And then, we exist within a very large number of ecosystems, not just in SAP, but across a number of different platforms. So we won't talk about all of this in detail today. But Deb, one of the things I think we wanted to convey is that Vertex, we do provide a lot of different solutions in the different areas, right?
Correct. Yeah. So if you look back, I joined Vertex back in 1991, and I was tasked with developing the mainframe COBOL solution. And at the time, the need in the marketplace was a sales tax calculation engine and the rates, the content, right? Tens of thousands of jurisdictions in the U.S., even dating back into the early 90s. Since then, the needs in the indirect tax space have evolved dramatically, not only for a sales tax engine, but determination and then procurement. We have a lot of clients that really need to automate that procurement process. Maybe traditionally they've had buyers make those tax decisions, right? But then as their business has expanded and they've gone from maybe 1 or 2 jurisdictions to 10, 20, or even across, the globe, they've found that it's a struggle to keep their buyers and their users up to date on the changing regulations.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go through. Okay, so just by the numbers, to recap some key things, we've been in business for over 40 years. We've got 4,000 plus customers. About, I think, 1,000 of those are running SAP. So we're definitely the leader in this space here, and we've got, a very large portion of the Fortune 500 running Vertex applications, and we support a lot of different rules and content. So that's going to be one of the key things. We've got a fantastic team of researchers here at Vertex that do a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of maintaining that content. And the other element here is our very strong partnership with SAP. So, SAP themselves are a Vertex customer, and we've been in partnership for a very long time, over 25 years. We're on the SAP store, we're SAP certified. As I mentioned earlier, we've got over 1,000 customers that run SAP and Vertex together. So definitely have the background here to support the entire SAP ecosystem. And then, of course, for what a lot of you are going through right now is the S4 migration. Either you've gone through it, you're planning it, or you're about to go through it. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how you can fold in the Vertex application as part of that and why it makes sense. Another thing we want to point out here is that we have multiple different integration points to different SAP applications, not just ERP, different types of the ERP under the SAP umbrella, but also areas like Ariba. Deb just mentioned the procurement. We're seeing a lot of companies doing the migration to S4 and bringing in Ariba as part of the mix as well. So we have a direct integration to Ariba. And there's a number of different functions that we provide as part of that integration. It's not just calculation. So there's lots of different things around the data management, data integrity, validations, analytics, the reporting, the compliance, the real-time invoice functionality as well. So it is quite broad and encompassing in terms of the functionality that we offer here. All right, so let's get into it. We've got quite a few items here. We've got 10. So the first is going to be probably the most basic, and that is around, why does it make sense to go to Vertex? Well, first answer there is rates. I think that particularly in the US, Deb, I thought it was 7,000, but it turns out it's actually 13,000 taxing jurisdictions in the US alone. And you kind of think about that breaking down into what individual, not only the state, but down to the city, the county, even districts. Which before I got into sales use taxes, I didn't even know what a district was. But yeah, there's quite a few of those, and that kind of exponentially increases the number of jurisdictions.
Right, and those especially these district taxes don't always align with a 5-digit zip code. A lot of folks think, oh, I can determine the appropriate taxes applicable based on the 5-digit zip code for a customer. We have mall taxes, and it may just be for a specific part of a street. We have unincorporated areas, right? So 5-digit zip where I live. I'm within the city limits, but if I had moved into the neighborhood down the street, I would be in an unincorporated area and not subject to pay that city tax as well. So it's becoming increasingly complex, and obviously your clients, customers want to be charged the correct tax, and you want to do the right thing as well.
Yeah, it's very, very nuanced. So one of the things we want to point out, and I had to go back through my archives here, Deb, to find these files, but this is what you would do in the old school days. Do you remember you had to load in the condition records with all the rates, and you had to make up your jurisdiction codes, or you had to bring in rate files that had that, and you had to load it and have it at each individual level. So this is what it kind of looks like when you don't have and subscribe to Vertex for the content. Is you're going to be loading in rate files and attaching them to your tax codes, I guess, and you have to maintain your own set of jurisdiction codes. So it's quite a laborious effort, and not something that we see too often anymore. But for those of you who still do it, we totally get the pain around it.
Yeah, and I've seen where a client of mine years back, because it was so complex and they were located all over the United States, they actually erred on the high side and would collect the highest rate in that state. So states like California and Illinois, et cetera, where the rates can vary when you cross a street, same zip code, they just erred on the high side, paying the difference, right? Because again, they didn't want to overcharge their customers, and that was, money out of pocket to them.
Yeah, that's got to add up over time. So this basically kind of shows you in terms of our calculation coverage, the content, pretty much I think we span the whole globe. I think the only areas that we don't cover is where there is no indirect tax. So, as I mentioned earlier, we've got a pretty extensive team who maintains the research around all those rates there. So when you subscribe to that, those updates happen automatically. You don't have to kind of load anything. That's part of what Vertex provides as part of the on-demand service. All right, so now let's move to number 2. And that is when we get to a more complex level of content, and that is around rules. And again, there's a lot of rules. So especially just in the US alone, what do we have? Something like 600,000 unique taxability rules. So Deb, I want to call out a couple of things, and maybe you can shed some light on, have 3 examples that sort of came to mind. One was this fairly new thing that I think has caught a lot of people off guard here, and that is the recent change in Minnesota. Is that right? Retail
Correct.
delivery fee?
Yeah. Yeah, so I started with Colorado, right? And then from there, it's now, it's becoming a thing, right? Minnesota, we're hearing New York, so other jurisdictions are going to start imposing these additional fees. So traditionally not a tax, but our clients look to us to help with these other fees and excise taxes. And this is one that we've delivered as standard content. Colorado is also standard content as well for those folks who have a need for us to calculate that. And then we're obviously tracking the other jurisdictions, and it will be standard content. But our content also includes recycling fees, other things, tire fees, right? That's a big
Monitor
need
fees.
for a lot of our,
Yeah. I see that coming up too. A very common complex areas around manufacturing, right? Exemptions around that.
Yeah, and it's become very complex because it used to be assumed that what you bought for manufacturing was exempt. And again, I go back into the 90s, it was a little bit easier back then. Now it's become so complex. There are parts of the manufacturing process in certain states where it won't be exempt. And there are states that actually reduce rate manufacturing. They don't fully exempt it. And then R&D and all that gets very complicated. And then what we find in the home rule jurisdictions, they tend to tax differently in Colorado than the state. We see that with the parishes in Louisiana. And again, that's all content that we provide to our clients. And we are tracking that and releasing updates each month if something changes.
Yeah, I think that could be quite a lot of work here. So we've got a team of, I think, over 100 that provide that research. And that's already embedded within the Vertex application. And here, I think, just want to show a snapshot here. What's this that we're looking at here, Deb?
Yeah, this is a look at the U.S. matrix. It's showing state by state all the different categories. Obviously, we can't on this slide show the 3,000 plus categories, but it's an extensive list both on the procurement side, what you procure, right? We're tracking is the service or the item that you're procuring taxable, exempt, or reduced rate in that jurisdiction. Each month we're releasing updates, and given so many jurisdictions now are in need of revenue, we're seeing more and more like services that traditionally in the past have been exempt are now being taxed or maybe reduced rated. So this matrix here, you see a little T and an asterisk under the Connecticut column that denotes those software categories that are reduced or taxed at a reduced rate of 1%.
Got it. Yep. All right. And so this content is maintained every month by Vertex, right? And automatically updates those categories. So what we see most companies do is map some of their data, whether it's material group, GL accounts, map that to the categories so that when those changes happen with the taxability around that, that automatically will apply an update depending on the effective dates of those changes. Fantastic. All right. So let's move, we're going to get a little more complicated now, and that's getting to tiers for tiers. So this is where, my head always spins around this. You're going to have to help explain what the complexity is around this, because I'm looking at this and I'm like, wow, how do we figure this out?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one. So for many years, Tennessee has had a max tax at the county level. So anything up to 1,600 is taxed at the full county rate, and then anything above that at an article level is not taxed. Well, then the state came out with what they called an extended tier, which meant anything that was above the 1,600 at the county level, the state was then going to tax 1,600 of that additional tax. So we call it an additional tier tax. Again, this has been an area that's very difficult for companies to try to set up in an ERP system like SAP or any of the ERP systems, because it's just there's multiple different taxes and tiers that have to be evaluated.
Absolutely. So yeah, this is something that automatically, again, is returned back from Vertex content, right? It can do the math to figure out what tier and what tax rate to apply at each tier. All right. Okay, moving right along. So now we're getting to 4. This is around situs. And so this is a term which is, I guess, applicable from a sales and use tax standpoint, particularly. Now we're going to talk about a few nuances here, which definitely, but before we do, let's kind of talk about the different types of taxes. You know, within particularly in the US, this is an example here where there's on a given transaction, let's say if you're doing a purchasing transaction, you could calculate a tax which could be either a sales tax, which might be the tax that you pay to a vendor. It could be something that happens within the same state, and that might be classified as a sales tax. The second might be a seller's use tax, where you might be buying from a vendor that's maybe outside of the state, so they're going to potentially charge you a different rate. And there are some states, I think, that have a different seller's use rate, right, Deb? I mean,
Arizona, Illinois, I believe Missouri, yes.
Yeah. So there's a handful of states that actually would have a different rate to charge you if it came from within state, where it's sales tax, versus coming from outside of the state, where it would be seller's use. And then the third type of rate you could be looking at is if, let's say, the vendor doesn't bill you any tax at all, and you have to self-assess that, that's what's known as consumer's use tax. And this could be totally a different rate altogether. I think there are a handful of states, again, that would have maybe a different rate. I think I'm going to show you an example in a second here, where all 3 of those rates could be different. So knowing which one to apply on a transaction, you're really going to have a lot of difficulty training a user to know that. Better to have the system figure that out, so we can determine based on, let's say, the ship from or the ordering address and the ship to, it can work out, you know, what rate to apply. So let's kind of look at a couple of examples here. So I found these, Deb, Arizona and Colorado are 2 classic ones, I think. And what this sort of illustrates, and, you know, I did a search on just simply city and the state, and I found 6 potential options within just Phoenix itself. Like you'd mentioned earlier, it could make a difference if it's across the street, you know, in or outside of the county or within a certain district. That rate could vary. And so there's 6 different rates that I found within this Phoenix, Arizona. And then within the 6 rates, it's potentially a different rate for sales, seller's use, or consumer's use. So you're potentially looking at an option of 18 rates here for a purchase into Phoenix. And then in Denver, I think we went up to close to 10 different options there, that there are 3 different rates for the sales, seller's use, and consumer's use. And there's potentially 10 different taxing jurisdictions, at least within Denver itself. So quite mind-boggling, but again, this all is standard content within Vertex rates. And then let's kind of talk about figuring out which rate actually applies. And so there's a couple of things to think about. One is the concept of sourcing. And, you know, a lot of states are what we call destination, where the taxes are based on the location where the goods or services are going to. That's destination. But there are a handful of states that are deemed origin, or others that are modified origin, where it could be some or all of the taxes are actually based on the vendor's location. And Arizona is a good example of that. So what we see here on the screen here is, let's say you got Phoenix and you got Tucson, both very hot places right now, but they have different rates for the sales, seller's use, and consumer's use. And let's say if you're buying something into Phoenix, and we have 2 kind of options here. Let's say you're shipping from outside of the state into Phoenix. So this would be a destination tax in that case. And then, so that's one option, and you'd be calculating the seller's use rate in that case. But then if you had another transaction that was actually coming from within the state, but from another city, then the taxes would actually be based on what's called the administrative origin. And the tax rate would be a sales tax in that case. So, having the nuances around this is a little bit complicated to figure out what, A, where to source it, and B, what type of tax to apply.
And Arizona is an interesting one in that, yes, you may have a transaction, whether it's sale or purchase, that appears to be sourced and being shipped from a plant or facility outside of Arizona. So it may look like it could be a seller's use tax rate. But if there is an actual business location or physical presence by that shipper, that seller into Arizona that's in Arizona, then they may have the obligation to collect sales tax instead of the seller's use tax. And again, that's something our solution can support.
Wow, that's another layered nuance on top of that.
Yeah.
And then one of our favorite states here is Colorado. And this is an example of Denver. So we've got Denver and Colorado. And you potentially, let's see if we look at a couple of scenarios here. So if you ship from within, and Colorado is a little more nuanced, right, Deb? Because it's not just within the state, but also within the same city, potentially, right? You could have a different answer if it's same city versus another city within Colorado. So that was one scenario where you could get the 8.5 if, let's say, you're shipping within Denver itself. But then if it's coming from outside, then that could be a seller's use tax, and you can see it's significantly lower than the in-state. But then there's a location requirement here as well, too, right, Deb?
Correct. That's correct. Yep.
Yeah, so one of the things that O-Series provides you is the ability to set up your locations, and then it can then determine and calculate whether or not the sales tax or the seller's use would apply based on that. All right, so, okay, so now let's talk about certificates. And this can be quite a painful area in terms of, for those of you out there who you maybe sell to exempt customers, they give you exemption certificates because they're perhaps resellers or maybe they're exempt entities. A lot of times as a seller, and particularly in some states where it's really on the burden on the seller to collect that certificate and prove under audit that you've got it, this can be quite a complicated area. And managing that is not something that you can easily do within just an ERP application on the customer master. It's a lot of times very nuanced, and a lot of times you have to have the right documentation and have it validated correctly. So Deb, maybe if you can talk about some of the challenges that we see companies struggle with before they put in one of our exemption cert applications.
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest challenges I've seen over the years is just actually responding to an audit, right? So I've had clients where the vast majority of who they sell to is exempt, and that's great. You can set that status, right, in the ERP system. But when it comes to responding to audit, it's a challenge, right? Maybe the certificates are sitting on a file server, and now they have to try to go to retrieve the certificates. The other big challenge is contacting customers when you need a refresh, when you need a new certificate, one has expired, et cetera. And then one other challenge that's really evolved over the years is certificates have obviously become more complex, right? Sometimes a certificate may be limited to a certain item that gets sold. That can be very, very challenging. Coding that back in an ERP system, users may have to actually put something on the actual order line to say, no, this is or isn't taxable. So our clients, obviously have a need for a solution that can help them not only collect and maintain those certificates and apply that exempt status as SAP is calling Vertex, but also, having a tool to produce the reports that they need for their audits and communicate with their customers when they need a new certificate as well.
Yeah, definitely. We can see challenges with companies who don't do a good job in maintaining those certs can actually be on the hook for that tax and be harder to sometimes, you might try to go and get the certificate from the customer maybe years after the sale. That customer may not be around anymore. So, that can definitely pose problems that affect the bottom line if you don't have that certificate kept up to date where you can prove that the exemption was warranted to an auditor. And sometimes that audit can happen many years after the transaction. So,
yeah. and if that's an area of exposure where the auditor has, where the state has actually been able to generate some, obviously some penalties and interest, that's going to be the first area they go to on the next audit as well. So,
yeah, absolutely. So, Deb, maybe you can talk us through some of the options for managing certificates and what it is that Vertex offers. Can you maybe walk us through what we can deploy to kind of help manage those challenges?
Yeah, absolutely. So our solution includes a tool called Certificate Center, and Certificate Center is it's a browser-based tool. It's a collection tool for obviously maintaining those certificates. It includes a self-service wizard. That's the box that says Certificate Wizard there, where you can direct your customers to. They ask a bunch of questions. If it's a form that can be generated there online, we can walk them through all the questions that are needed to fill that state form, and then they can digitally sign it, and it'll drop into an approval queue for someone to view and approve. And once that becomes approved, then that's an active certificate in your engine for applying to your sales orders and your billing documents. It also is a really nice tool in that, let's just say a customer's emailed that certificate. Maybe it went to customer service, maybe it went to the tax department, but very simple tool for entering that certificate information so that it's in your O series and you're ready to start billing your customers.
Yep. And I notice also in the bottom right there that, we have some companies that need a little bit of help with getting those certificates collected and scanned and kind of put in there. We also provide a service to support that as well, right? Fantastic. Okay.
And I will say just one other thing. This is implementing the tax engine, right, with S4. It's always a good time, right, to actually go do a refresh with your customers as well. As Susie mentioned, maybe you have certificates for customers that, no longer in business. Maybe they retired. So it's a good time to do a refresh, get a new certificate, whether you do it internally or if you look for, a third party to help with that process, then you'll have a certificate center that's set up right with the most current certificates for your customers.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point because, I see that a lot of times during S4 migrations, there is a big push to get data cleaned up. And so, going from ECC to S4, you may be cleaning out like a lot of redundant customers and yes, going back and removing those that are no longer you're doing business with anymore, consolidating and doing that. So as part of that cleanup, when you go from, maintaining customers to maintaining business partners in S4, that is the perfect time to also make sure your certificates are cleaned up and up to date as well. So it's important you have all that in sync. And so that absolutely makes sense to do that in conjunction with each other. And I also want to point out another thing. It's not on this diagram here, but one of the other things that we have customers asking us about is, in SAP, maintaining the customer master, being able to make sure that that is in sync with what you've got set up in O Series to be exempt for. And we've actually got some plugin tools as well. One is called Flux Builder. It's one that kind of sits within SAP and actually reads off the SAP customer master and makes it easy to kind of update the records into Vertex so that you can then, push customer records, push the exemption certs themselves, and keep it kind of tied into the customer master. Because what you don't want is to have two very separate systems that don't talk to each other. So we do have a number of what we call plus tools that we plug in to help with that. We've also got another one called drop shipment. We see a lot of customers, particularly in the US, that drop ship to their end customer's location and might find that they don't always have a certificate on file for that ship to location, that they want to apply what's called home state reciprocity rules and help manage that. So we have another plus tool that kind of helps to manage that. Because one of the things you have to think about, and we'll get to this in one of our other points that we're going to make, is that, taxes are very much part of order to cash. It's very much part of master data setup. And, because of that, you want to make sure that as you're doing that migration to S4 and you're optimizing your processes, you're bringing about more efficiencies, that as it impacts taxes and vice versa, as tax impacts those items, that you're kind of in sync in terms of making sure that you're optimizing that process. So that's why putting in a full suite of tax automation applications makes sense when you do that S4 migration. Okay, so we're just over the halfway point here, and now we're going to start talking about reporting. Reporting and compliance can mean many things. There's lots of different types of reports and compliance steps that tax teams need to, um, uh, you know, legally be compliant with. And so if we talk about what some of those requirements look like, so Deb, maybe you can talk about some of the reporting offerings that we have that would kind of go above and beyond what would be just a standard SAP report for taxes or custom reports. We see a lot of companies having to do custom reports before they put in the Vertex applications. Can you maybe talk about the different types of reporting that tax teams have to think about?
Yeah, absolutely. So as Susie had mentioned, reporting can mean different things. Oftentimes we see that the tax folks need reports for analytical reasons, right? They just want to review, okay, what was our liability or our exempt sales for this jurisdiction, for this plant? What sales tax did we pay to our supplier on these items for this time period as well? So more for analysis, make certain you're collecting the right tax from your customers, et cetera. We also need reports to respond to audit, right? And those reports need to have all the information that went into actually determining the tax on that particular sales transaction or purchase transaction, including was the customer exempt, and if they were exempt, what was the exempt reason and what was the exempt number, et cetera. And then reporting also includes the compliance piece, right? What's needed to actually prepare the tax returns. Susie, anything you wanted to add there?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the areas that we see pain points is the reporting for the procure to pay side. So I think that, the standard reports out of SAP may not have everything that we've seen tax teams need to respond to an audit around use taxes. And, you mentioned a lot of fields are needed. I think in our accelerator, we've pre-developed reports that sit within SAP, read SAP tables. We read something like 40 or 60 different tables in order to produce a single report for the AP line item, and in order for the tax team to be able to respond to audits. So there's a lot of information that they need to pull from many different tables. And the old school way is having your IT team write you a custom report, basically reading from all the tables and putting it together. But, the good thing about the Vertex, what we call the accelerator, it's basically a suite of pre-developed applications that we install in SAP. And one of them is a suite of reports. And what that would do is kind of pull everything together into the format that you need. And these reports have been around for a long time. I think well over 15 years. We've had customers using these reports to support their audits. So I think that, being able to have pre-developed reports is important, because building your own custom reports can be quite problematic in terms of not only the build and the effort, but also maintaining them ongoing. I think that tax teams have a common set of issues and requirements. So it's always good to be part of a very large community of companies that use these reports, as opposed to kind of being on an island and having your IT team build you a custom report for you.
Yeah, and these pre-developed reports are ideal. If you think of the data that's in the SAP ERP system, it's going to be far greater than what would ever be sent and recorded in text.
Yeah, and I think
will provide visibility into everything. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think that being able to supplement the Vertex reporting with the SAP reporting is important, because you do get things out of the Vertex reports that you wouldn't get out of the SAP reports, and vice versa. But yes, there's a lot of information that we provide, and we also have reconciliations that tie the two together as well. Now, when we go into the global stage, I think that gets even more complicated. Globally, there is still the requirement to be able to, file returns, what we call compliance. But there's another layer of, reporting that's sort of needed as well, and that's around what we call invoice IQ and e-invoicing. Can you speak to any of that, Deb, in terms of what you see globally companies are really needing to implement beyond just sort of transactional reporting?
Yeah, absolutely. So the need is around, as you mentioned, the e-invoicing. That's becoming a very hot topic, right, in the in the tax world, with many countries obviously going in that direction, but then also the compliance piece as well. And then when you mentioned the invoice IQ, right, the ability to make certain that everything's compliant, right, do the validation, the VAT validation of that registration number as well.
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of pressure now to get things right first time,
Yep.
Not necessarily to, process the transaction and the invoice and then go back in later on and look and then make the corrections. Particularly on the global stage, that's just not acceptable. A lot of the taxing jurisdictions are needing that tax, that VAT, the GST, to be correct up front before that invoice is posted and registered. So that definitely does increase the speed to which companies now have to respond to get all that validated. And we've got a number of applications that will help get to that need. So quite a few different reports that we support. If you look at the different returns that we support in North America, globally as well, and being able to get to not only getting things that are return ready, submission ready, but also being able to provide the scope of the data is very important, and that's what we can kind of cover through the different Vertex reporting options and solutions that we have. And I think S4 is definitely the time to deploy that because, one of the questions I get is, with S4, there's a consolidation of tables, things are different, between ECC and S4, and also performance is better. S4 provides better analytical tools, better performance from a database standpoint, where you're not having to go out and store things in a kind of a business warehouse or a separate warehouse, that you can do more reporting out of S4 now. And I think that that's important to keep things within the ERP, and that it provides better support to being able to run and report on many, many more transactions and into the millions. Whereas that might have been a little bit harder with ECC. That would have been, pushing reporting out to different options. I think with S4, we're seeing more companies wanting to handle that reporting directly within S4. So number 7, and this kind of speaks to having a single tax platform in the context of what we're seeing with companies, the change that's happening, that, we don't see companies just having one ERP talking to one tax engine. I think what we're seeing with global consolidations, a lot of the M&A activity, that we're seeing companies that have multiple ERPs, multiple billing applications, e-commerce applications, marketplace platforms, and it's definitely more complicated. And what you don't want to have is to basically have little point solutions within each one of these source systems to calculate the taxes. Having an enterprise application, a single application that talks to all of those, is where companies are going and have been going for the last many years, and that is to consolidate into a single source and a single provider that can give you all of that. So this kind of goes back to the earlier diagram that we pulled up, where you've got a very comprehensive Vertex suite of not just tax but reporting and analytics and data integrity tools, but then it talks to we've got over 200 integrations, and I think maybe even more. And then we've got the facility for companies to build different integrations to Vertex using their own APIs. But I think this is definitely, when we see S4 migrations, we see companies trying to consolidate the ERPs, but not everything can go in S4. There are also a lot of satellite applications, and what you don't want is many different tax methods. You want to kind of have everything point to one single tax platform. Deb, that's sort of what you're seeing as well, right?
Yeah,
any thoughts or
absolutely.
comments
Yeah,
on that?
a single source, right, for reporting, right? We talked about how critical reporting is. You don't want to have to merge spreadsheets from various different systems, but also there may be some synergies in the actual setup of the solution, right? The actual determination. So if you can map something once to a category versus multiple times for the different systems, that's going to be, much easier to maintain.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're still seeing too many companies running through things through spreadsheets. So yeah, we definitely want to see that shift where we can get rid of the spreadsheet reporting. All right. Now let's move on to number 8. And this kind of talks about the indirect tax function really heavily embedded in your business functions. So, as you go to S4HANA, whether it's your on-prem or the private cloud version, there's many different call out points or touch points where you need to have a tax calculated, on the procure to pay side, to the point, going back to when you do a requisition or when you're trying to estimate the taxes through purchase orders, receipt of goods or services, through the different AP and accounting steps. And then on the sales side, when you're quoting or when you're doing orders and going all the way past delivery through to billing, there's various call out points where you need taxes. But then on top of that, there's a number of sort of non-standard call out points that are needed. And, we found that over the years that it's not just a matter of, hey, where are the standard call out points and this is all we need. A lot of tax teams need additional calculations. I'll give you a couple of examples. So in the US, for example, when you have to do what we call use tax accruals on things like inventory consumption, or maybe you've got a procurement card program where you're buying things from suppliers, they may not charge you all the taxes and you have to self-assess the taxes that aren't charged. So you then have to do calculations on P-card. A third example might be you may buy something tax-free and then you distribute it to all of your different cost centers, or you distribute the use of it like software, and then you've got to accrue taxes on all of those individual usage points. And those sort of transactions or trigger points are not necessarily ones that make a natural call out to any tax engine from SAP. Sometimes you have to kind of have that sort of solution in place to facilitate those. And so when we get to that level, that's where you'll need kind of to bring in some of these ABAP enhancements. We have got a number of what we call plus tools that can trigger the call out to Vertex so that you can make all the tax calculations at all the points that you need, not just the standard order to cash and procure to pay. So you'll see there's a lot of different touch points, and that when you move to S4, you want to make sure you've optimized those touch points, you've got the right calculation calls happening, because as you process through those transactions, you want to ensure that to the first point you get the taxes estimated, because the earlier you can get that tax estimated, the better you will be in terms of approving the taxes and so forth. Let me kind of now show you a couple of sort of flows to help you visualize what that is. And Deb, what we have here is an example of the order to cash flow. And you think about within S4, you've got, being able to process sales orders through to billing and accounting. And there are these natural call out points that go out to Vertex O series to calculate those taxes. But what we do at Vertex is we don't just leave it here. There's a lot more that we know is part of the overall process that impacts not only the tax team, but also the sales order, the billing team, the credits team, the master data team. And so this is what we wanted to kind of give you a visualization of how the end-to-end Vertex solution would work. So you first plug it in. You've got just basic calculation points that occur. One of the things that we'll do is we can help you with your jurisdiction code conversion. So the jurisdiction codes in SAP will basically store the Vertex tax area IDs, which are our proprietary location codes that we tax based on. And so we've got tools that help you with that master data conversion. We also have tools that help you with that integration to make sure that we're sending the correct data over to Vertex so that you can make tax decisions on multiple data elements. We also have the pre-developed accelerator reports, which will report on all of your billing transactions so that you have that for audits, your compliance, your reconciliations. And then we also have what we call plus tools. These are additional programs that we install in SAP, and they do things that we have found tax or other teams have needed to ensure that they've got a really optimal process. So we have a program called Flux Monitor. And what that does is it monitors for changes in SAP data changes or config changes that might impact the tax function. And this is to basically alleviate the need to have tax teams put on every email notification stream. They can kind of run their own reports to see changes that occur in the system that might impact them. We've also got some tools to help you with your exemption management. As Deb had talked about earlier, managing those exemption certs can really create liability for companies. So being able to tie those exemption certs back to your customer master, we have Flux Builder that helps to facilitate that. We've also got the drop shipment program for reciprocity rules. And then we've got a program that helps you process tax only credits. So this is a big gap area where companies need to be able to process sales tax refunds, but not have to do an entire cancel and rebill. So we've got a way of being able to do those where it's a very synchronized, connected way of doing the tax credits. Makes it a lot easier for the collections team, the billing team, the tax team to ensure that you're doing those credits in a very clean, connected manner and being able to report on those adjustments as well. And then finally, we've got a Plus tool called Test Suite, which can really help you with your testing. So as you deploy Vertex and you want to test it end to end from sales order through to billing, you can run our testing program, which will help you build the test scripts, validate the master data for the scripts, actually process and create the sales order through to billing, including delivery and inventory replenishment, and be able to trigger all the calculation calls through to Vertex as part of that testing. So quite a kind of complete picture. It's not just putting a tax engine in. We do a lot more in terms of the end-to-end, and that's taken in consideration the fact that tax is a function that affects many other cross functions as well. Any other comments on this, Deb? I know we've kind of gone through a lot here, but
Nope.
Any thoughts around this one?
Nope.
Okay. Let's sort of just touch briefly on the procure to pay side. We're running a little bit short on time now, so I'm going to speed it up a little bit, but this is around Ariba. And we bring this one up because we see with S4, a lot of companies also go to Ariba as part of that. And, big questions arise around, okay, if I've got Ariba, how can I utilize that and then maximize the tax function in that? So this is where you can connect with our Vertex Ariba connector and call out to O Series directly from Ariba at the time of purchase requisition. You can also do it at time of invoice reconciliation, where you can calculate the taxes using Vertex and compare that to what your vendor bills you. And then also optionally, you can utilize it to accrue the taxes from within Ariba and post it directly to the Vertex reporting. So what this facilitates is the ability to estimate taxes at the purchase recs in Ariba, and also to validate and compare those taxes with the suppliers at the time of invoice processing. So this is an example of how Vertex can plug into an upstream procurement process. And we're seeing this with a lot of S4 deployments as companies more and more are going to Ariba. All right, now we're getting in the home stretch here. Number 9 is really about meeting tax needs. And Deb and I have sort of covered some of the complexities around calculation and jurisdictions and reporting. But we thought this was a nice summation to kind of show if you're contemplating, hey, when I go to S4, can I keep doing everything manually in SAP? Or does it make sense to go to Vertex and utilize that? And this is a good illustration here of what you would sort of get if you were to just do it in native SAP versus if you're deploying it with the Vertex application. So you can see there's quite a big difference in all the features and functionality and requirements that we can meet with the Vertex application, whether it's O Series or through using some of our accelerators and plus tools that we install within SAP itself. All right, and Deb, this gets us to number 10, and maybe you kind of talk to the audience here about project efficiency and why, from a timing standpoint, it makes sense to deploy Vertex with your S4 migration. We've actually got 10 points within this.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously, we've talked about the challenges that we've seen over the years with tax compliance, right, and keeping up with the changing tax rates and rules. But what we're seeing now with folks moving to the S4 environment is they want to obviously re-engineer business process, right? They want to get out of the business of asking the users to make manual tax decisions, but by aligning Vertex with the S4 implementation you'll be able to actually meet the actual tax requirements, automate the tax processes all at the same time as you're re-engineering the other business processes as well. So utilizing the same testing resources, et cetera, same testing waves at the same time as we're automating the actual tax process.
Yeah, definitely makes sense. And when you think about the project of deploying Vertex O Series and the project of S4, is that it kind of fits into it. And the way I always view it is it's like another module, but it's a module that touches a lot of the other modules. And so, as you mentioned, the re-engineering part of it, as you're making those changes in S4, it makes sense to utilize, reflect, optimize that as part of your Vertex deployment. And we definitely see from an economies of scale standpoint that when you do the Vertex with your S4, you do get a lot of efficiencies from a budget and a resource standpoint when you're doing, you know, the design sessions together, when you're doing the testing together, because a lot of the testing you'll be doing for the SD, MM, and FI testing would be the same testing that you're wanting to test for the tax integration with Vertex. So it definitely makes sense to kind of do that together versus trying to chunk it out into separate phases. But I'm seeing a question coming up actually, which is quite relevant for what we're talking about here. And Deb, that is, what is the average implementation time for Vertex? Do you have any thoughts around what we kind of, and I know that's a very loaded question, but
Yeah.
you know, what would you say has been sort of like, yeah, it'll be kind of within this range typically?
So what I heard decades with tax people, it depends, right? Well, it's going to be the same answer here. It's really going to depend. But ideally, if you're going to implement Vertex with an S4 deployment, you want to bring tax in early, right? So we want to be there in the actual design phase. You don't have to go back and redesign something if you're already into the testing phase. So we would fall in line with the S4 integration, but typically you don't need the implementation team for tax specific resources the whole time, right? They're just going to be called on to obviously help design, right? Develop the actual solution to automate the decisions, configure, and then help as needed throughout the testing process as well. So if you're already live in an S4 environment, right, it again will depend on, you know, several different factors. What's the scope? Is it sales and purchasing? Do we have an Ariba system as well? But we can obviously help you with understanding what that effort would look like in your environment.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm also seeing another question about, it's sort of related, and that is about phases. That you know, can you deploy Vertex in phases? And we do see that, right? We see companies that might deploy Vertex for a certain region or country, and then kind of roll it out after that. So you can kind of get the baseline config in for that. And then the good thing about it is it's fairly scalable, and then you can from there roll out. Maybe sometimes that would mirror the S4 migration rollout as well. Very good. All right, so I think we're almost at time here, and just want to recap some of the key takeaways here, and that is around the complexity of indirect taxes, and it's A, quite complex, and B, quite you're changing all the time, and also that the S4 migration is the perfect time because that's also a very good catalyst for change within your organization, within how you do things within your procure to pay and order to cash process. So that really makes sense to couple the Vertex deployment with that. And what we see, tax teams, their needs are quite complex, and it really makes sense to meet those needs and future-proof at the same time. So as we were able to talk about today, the tax needs being particularly complex makes it really hard to handle them out of your standard SAP condition record tables. It makes sense to kind of push that to an application which really is scalable, where the content is maintained for you, and you're really just kind of pointing to that and letting that be maintained by Vertex. So that also puts you in a good position from a future-proofing standpoint as your organization grows, goes into new regions. You can leverage all that Vertex content as you move there. So that kind of brings us to the end of the session. We're at 53 minutes past the hour here. Thank you very much for joining us. If for those of you who we didn't get to your questions, we will follow up with you via email. And also don't forget there's a little survey with a couple of questions that you can take anytime. And that'll kind of give us a good idea of where you are in your journey. But feel free if you want to reach out to either Deb or myself. This is our email and contact information. And we hope this was a helpful session for you. And Deb, thank you very much for your insights today.
Yep, thank you, everyone.